The Warhammer franchise is full of ludicrously powerful characters, and it makes sense, because it seems like just about everything in this universe is designed to kill you in the most horrifying way imaginable. But despite the plethora of transhuman super soldiers, golden demigod guardians, immortal killing machines, and masters of the psychic arts, there are entities that dwell just beyond the stars that make them all look like ants by comparison. Beings of unimaginable destructive potential that can sunder entire worlds and unleash legions of terrifying armies at a whim. From the dark and sinister chaos gods, to the ancient and terrifying Catan, from the master of mankind, to a pair of bumbling orc deities too busy fighting each other to do much of anything else. These are the top 10 most powerful entities in the entire 40K franchise. And apologies ahead of time if my voice is a little raspy, I'm actually getting over a cold. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's dive headfirst into the grimdark. Number 10. Cegorach. Cegorach is the Eldari trickster god most commonly associated with the faction known as the Harlequins. Now over the years, he has gone by many names, including the Laughing God or the Great Fool. He is one of the only surviving members of the Eldari pantheon, as aside from himself, Khaine the god of war, and Isha the goddess of healing, each of the other deities would be systematically hunted down and murdered by the newborn chaos god Slaanesh. The legend goes that due to his mocking nature and aloof personality, he was able to distance himself from the acts of hedonism and debauchery that would eventually give rise to Slaanesh in the first place. When the Chaos God was born, he escaped into the Webway, where he remained largely unaffected, while the rest of the Pantheon would inevitably be cut down. If you're unfamiliar with the Webway, it's a pocket dimension that exists between universes. Its many paths spider web across the galaxy, allowing those who can parse its secrets to travel great distances without facing the dangers of utilizing the warp for travel. Cegorach is rumored to have picture-perfect knowledge of all of the infinite paths and corridors within the Webway, and he thus imparts that knowledge upon his followers, allowing the Harlequins to seemingly appear and reappear anywhere across the galaxy. Cegorach's power does not necessarily come in the form of brute force, and more so in his guile and ability to manipulate. It was he who tricked the Catan into devouring their kin, but we'll touch on them a little bit later in this video. Buried deep within the Webway itself is an Eldari craft world known as the Black Library. The Black Library is said to be a repository of all the knowledge the Eldar as a species ever managed to gain into the entities that live within the warp, and thus it is fiercely guarded by the Harlequins. At the center of the Black Library exists a legendary tome that has been locked with spiritual chains since the collapse of the Eldar Empire. However, as we move into the 42nd millennium, those chains have finally been broken. Supposedly, the book contains the words of Cegorach himself, and written within a certain passage is a prediction of a new future path that completely circumvents the inevitable destruction of the universe by the Chaos Gods, an event the Eldar refer to as Ranadandra. The Laughing God uses his followers, and very specific entities known as Shadow Seers, to make sure certain events happen at certain times in very specific ways. They view the entire galaxy as a stage, and each and every living creature as an actor in the grand performance. By making sure certain events come to pass, they thus will manifest Cegorach's alternative future into existence. He is one of the most intentionally mysterious and cryptic characters in the entirety of 40K lore, but his influence can be felt in just about every major pivotal event over the last couple thousand years. For example, even though Yvraine and the Eldar God of the Dead are often credited with the resurrection of Guilliman, it was actually one of his Shadow Seers that pushed Belisarius Cawl to continue his research into the Cadian pylons, which not only gave Cadia a fighting chance against the Despoiler's incursion, but would also lead him to the discovery of certain minerals that would eventually be used in the Armor of Fate, the suit of armor that was used in Guilliman's resurrection. Not to mention, some believe that Cegorach was directly responsible for Ynid's resurrection in the first place, but we'll get into that in another video. Number 9. The Catan. The Catan were known to be ancient and frighteningly powerful star gods, created at the beginning of time out of the fundamental energies of the universe. They were incorporeal and formless beings whose appetite was so insatiable that they literally drained the life from the stars they encountered by wrapping themselves entirely around them and snuffing them out of existence. This would plunge all of the life-bearing worlds in the surrounding systems into complete and total darkness, confining all of the living species that dwelt there to the halls of extinction. These ancient creatures would end up forming an alliance with the Necron Tier in a war against their hated rivals, the Old Ones. It was the Catan that tricked their allies into throwing themselves into the Great Furnaces, causing them to shed their bodies of flesh to instead exist as an engram copy of consciousness within a living metal form. Together they would war against the Old Ones and their creations, in a war that spanned the entirety of the Milky Way and was known as the War in Heaven. They had, however, deceived their allies, and when the Necron tier shed their bodies of flesh, the Catan would gorge themselves on their souls. This would result in them becoming ascended, and reaching even more insane and terrifying heights of power. At their peak, they were said to be able to raise entire worlds with a single glance, and extinguish entire systems by summoning forth reality-warping black holes. However, despite their truly awe-inspiring power, their own hubris would end up being their downfall. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this video, it was actually the laughing god of the Eldari that slowly manipulated the Catan against one another. They would end up feeding on each other until only 5 were left: the Flayer, the Deceiver, the Nightbringer, the Void Dragon, and the Outsider. The Necrons would eventually turn on their would-be gods, and the Maynarch dynasty would destroy the Flayer outright. The Void Dragon would end up wounded and flee to Earth in order to prey on humanity. It was ultimately defeated by the Emperor and imprisoned upon Mars. The Nightbringer and the Deceiver would end up shattered, and the Outsider, said to be the most powerful of all of them, would end up being driven into insanity by the lingering bits of consciousness in its mind of all of the other Catan it had consumed. The voices eventually caused it to flee our galaxy in a self-imposed exile. Not much is known about it past this, so it's difficult to quantify its abilities. That being said, it is believed that the Outsider is the only living intact Catan, and if the mad star god was to ever return to the Milky Way, it would be an apocalyptic level threat. When it comes to figuring out just how strong the Catan are, we can look to their shards. The shards themselves are the only thing that remains of the Catan after they were enslaved and shattered by the Necrons. These are some of the most powerful weapons and energy sources that the Necrons have at their disposal, and are unleashed upon the battlefield when they encounter a particularly stubborn enemy that refuses to yield before Necron superiority. Despite the fact that they exist in a fractured state, each one is said to be a being of near unlimited power, manifesting energy blasts made of pure antimatter, dominating the minds of lesser beings in their vicinity, manipulating the flow of time, and even banishing those that stand before them to alternate realities. The 8th edition Necron Codex tells us that their power is limited only by their immense and terrifying imaginations. The Catan shards of the Nightbringer are said to be some of the most powerful the Necrons have access to, which makes sense, as the Nightbringer was the incarnation of death itself, a creature that delighted in inflicting pain and suffering, and was said to be the one that introduced the emotion of fear to the physical universe. It destroyed entire star systems on a whim, and gorged itself on the agony it inflicted on countless billions. It's generally believed by the Warhammer community that at the apex of their power, the Catan were easily the most powerful beings to have ever existed solely in the physical universe, and many assume they were the equal to the Chaos Gods, albeit the physical universe's version of them. However, this belief exists solely in the realm of speculation. As far as I'm aware, there is no actual source that states this to be true, or gives us a real actual grasp on just how ludicrously powerful they actually were. It's unfortunately one of those things that's just left up to our imagination. Now, if we were to take the absolutely ridiculous power of a single Catan shard and magnify it by 1,000 to get an idea of just how powerful a fully powered Catan actually was, the result is admittedly pretty horrifying. These would be entities that could destroy entire systems or vast sections of space with a snap of their fingers. But as it stands, this is still all just speculative. We don't know how many individual shards of each Catan exist. It could be a few dozen or thousands, though due to just how big of a deal each one is made out to be, it's likely that they are relatively rare. We also have to bear in mind that the Catan were ultimately defeated and enslaved by the Necrons, a species that is definitely insanely powerful, not to take anything away from the Necrons. But despite that, the shattering of the Catan is a factual example of a mortal race killing or enslaving gods. That is to say, a similar occurrence has never occurred with the Chaos Gods. Such an idea is pretty much unthinkable. So because of this, despite how powerful the Catan are, they just aren't quite on the same level as the Chaos Gods. Number 8. Khaine. Khaine, also known as Khaine or Khaine the Bloody-Handed, is the bloodthirsty Eldari god of war, wrath, and destruction. During the War in Heaven, Khaine would end up in a battle with the Nightbringer, where he subsequently defeated it, shattered its necrodermis body, and, adding further insult to injury, hurled its scythe into the warp. So, in a sense, Khaine was able to defeat the figurative and semi-literal embodiment of death itself. This fight would, however, have major consequences for Khaine, as the shattered body of the Catan exploded into a storm of shards, many of them piercing its flesh and forever tainting Khaine's body with its essence. Since Khaine is a mythological figure, other than this fight with the Nightbringer, we don't get a lot of insight into just how powerful they actually are. So instead, we will turn to the avatars of Khaine, which exist as a sliver of his true power. An avatar of Khaine is a fiery manifestation of Khaine's wrath, an entity that towers over the battlefield and can cleave armored vehicles in half with a single swing of their sword. They leave a burning trail of destruction in their wake wherever they go, and are constantly surrounded by a swirling inferno that causes everything in their vicinity to burst into flames. Much like how the god they are an aspect of was known for its unquenchable thirst for battle, the Avatar will not rest until all of the enemies of the Eldari and all of their fortifications are left as nothing more than smoldering ruins. The carnage the Avatars can inflict is absolutely legendary, despite the fact that many 40K authors have unfortunately disrespected them by using them as a simple plot device to show off just how strong their main characters are. Regardless of this plot-based nonsense, the reality is these monstrosities are some of the most powerful weapons the Eldar have access to, each and every one existing as only a sliver of Khaine's full, unfractured power. The fact that Khaine was able to kill the Nightbringer in its full, unshattered form is an absolutely remarkable feat, and is why he ranks above the Catan in the list. However, Khaine himself would in fact be defeated by a different god, and in a twist of fate similar to that of the Catan, would end up shattered into thousands of fragments. Number 7. Slaanesh. Slaanesh, also known as the Dark Prince or She Who Thirsts, is the chaos god of excess, hedonism, debauchery, and all things kinky and depraved. Every single sentient creature, no matter how stoic, is not completely free from desire. Whether it be physical, mental, or spiritual, we all have needs and wants that we wish to see fulfilled. Likewise, these desires exist upon a precipice, and if pushed too far, can descend into full-blown obsession, that which She Who Thirsts feeds upon. Desire can come in infinite forms. It could be something humble, like a starving laborer that desires nothing more than food for their family. Something a bit more ego-driven, like a politician's lust for power. Or on the depraved end of the spectrum, the sadistic killer's inclination to inflict pain. Whenever a mortal gives in to temptation of any form, they are unknowingly courting Slaanesh. The act of giving in pushes them further along a dark path towards depravity and insanity. Slaanesh will then guide the individual to seek out ever more heightening extremes, eventually leaving them as an addict that can only experience pleasure through the darkest and most sadistic of actions. Slaanesh watches from their dark realm in utter delight as the galaxy descends further into debauchery. They view mortals as nothing more than playthings, toys that were designed to be poked, prodded, and manipulated. Slaanesh is the youngest of the 4 gods, and thus is generally viewed as the weakest, although this description can be misleading. Slaanesh's power is far more subtle and manipulative than, say, the raw strength of Khorne or the voracious diseases of Nurgle. Their demons, likewise, are primarily designed to invoke the desperate and hedonistic desires of mortal hearts. They are entities formed of contradiction, jarringly graceful and repugnantly beautiful, enchanting yet ultimately horrifying. Much like how Slaanesh themselves is said to be so disarmingly beautiful and alluring that no mortal can look upon them without instantly losing their soul. Slaanesh was born from the rampant degeneracy that had come to infect Eldar society after the War in Heaven. The depraved energy the species generated gestated in the warp before finally reaching a breaking point, which gave birth to a new chaos god. The resulting birth scream literally ripped a hole in reality, and the resulting shockwave killed each and every Eldar on every world for hundreds of light years. The terrible wound in reality where the 2 universes now overlap is what we know today as the Eye of Terror. Immediately after their birth, Slaanesh would go on an absolute murderous rampage and would kill all of the gods of the Eldar pantheon, with the exception of Isha, Khaine, and Cegorach. So despite how ridiculously powerful each of them were, they were nothing in comparison to She Who Thirsts, who systematically slaughtered each and every one of them, without taking a rest between each kill. Cegorach managed to escape into the webway, whereas Isha was spared by Slaanesh but then ultimately kidnapped by Nurgle. Khaine would be the last one on Slaanesh's hit list, but even against a god who had just battled multiple other deities, he was no match for the Dark Prince and ended up shattered into thousands of shards. I'll point out that being the weakest of the 4 Chaos Gods is kinda like being the weakest heavyweight champion of the world. Yeah, some other title holder would probably beat them if they both fought during their prime, but against the rest of us normies, it would be an absolute slaughter. It's also important to note that when we talk about the Chaos Gods and just how powerful they are, the lore states that at one point each and every one of them was the most powerful. With Slaanesh, it definitely would have been right after their birth. Because of this, I'm going to be ordering the Chaos Gods where they fall in the hierarchy as of the 42nd millennium. Number 6. Nurgle. Nurgle, the grandfather, lord of plagues and disease, is the god of the cycle of life and death, entropy, rot, decay, and pestilence. He stands apart from the other gods that, in his own, albeit disturbing way, is the only one of the pantheon that genuinely cares for his followers. He views each and every one of them as his beloved children, and bestows upon them ever more generous blessings in the form of new supernatural diseases, demonic parasites, and all forms of sickening mutation. Every pox, boil, blister, and sore is viewed by those who worship him as a sign of his love. He is the embodiment of the fear of death shared by all sentient creatures, perhaps the first fear to have ever existed in this universe. But despite this, he teaches his followers that life and death, growth and decay, are all part of the same cycle, one that cannot change. He tells them to not fight against this cycle, but to embrace it, to embrace the despair of death. He teaches that entropy is the one unchanging truth of the universe. All things have a beginning and an end. Every life will end. Every civilization will rise and fall. Every tower will eventually crumble, and every disease will eventually run its course. He is the mastermind behind every virus, disease, and plague that has ever existed in the mortal universe, or even these supernatural diseases of the soul that emanate from the immaterium. Much like the Great Cycle, or perhaps more accurately, like the proliferation and subsequent remission of a disease, so too does Nurgle's power wax and wane. There were moments in time where plague runs rampant across the galaxy, and Nurgle's power is at its apex, surpassing all of the other gods and becoming a truly unstoppable force. It is, however, inevitable that his power will wane again, and he will be relegated to a relatively weak point in the pantheon. As a result, these power spikes are vastly more predictable than those of his siblings. Despite their disturbing appearance, the warriors that have pledged themselves to his service are incredibly resilient, and many of whom can suffer multiple mortal wounds and keep marching forward as if nothing happened. Blades get caught in rancid rolls of diseased blubber, and bolter shells are absorbed and rusted to dust inside of their bodies. It is as if the cycle has simply paused for them, their bodies displaying the telltale signs of rot and disease, yet they are seemingly immune to its effects. They cannot die by natural means and are completely immune to pain. Before we dive any deeper, here's a quick shout out to this video's sponsor. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made and allows you to play as more than 2,000 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships in dynamic combined arms PvP battles. Every single vehicle in this game is incredibly detailed and modeled down to their individual components, creating an insanely immersive combat experience. The game's collection of vehicles is frankly ridiculous and spans over 100 years of development from the 1920s all the way up to the present day. War Thunder features an in-depth customization system that allows you to fully customize all of the game's vehicles, with hundreds of different camouflages, historical markings, and 3D decorators such as bushes and equipment to make all of the war machines distinctly yours, all of which are rendered in beautiful 4K resolution. My favorite part about this game is just how realistic the combat is. There's no hit points in the game. Every one of the vehicles has a bunch of components and a crew. When those take a critical hit, the vehicle can suffer a wide array of different effects, one of which being exploding in spectacular detail. War Thunder is available on PC, Xbox Series X and S, PlayStation 5, and the previous console generation. Click on the link in the description of this video to download the game for free today and receive a huge bonus pack including multiple premium vehicles, a premium account trial, boosters, and a whole lot more. Big thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Number 5. Gork and Mork. Despite the previous couple of entries on this list, I'm sure you were expecting another chaos god here. But that is in fact incorrect, my friend. It's Gork and Mork, the gods of the orcs. Almost all of the lore we have about them comes from the orcs themselves. They say they are the biggest and toughest gods. One is brutally cunning and the other is cunningly brutal. Mork is clever enough to wait for you to have your back turned before hitting you twice as hard, whereas Gork will hit you regular-like, but then when you turn to face him, he'll punch you twice as hard. Because of this, it is common for orcs to have a favorite of the two gods. Gork represents the pure aggressive nature of the orcs and is more preferred by boys, knobs, and any straightforward orc fighter, whereas Mork's cunningness makes him the preferred deity of the more esoteric orc units, like Weird Boys, Commandos, and Mech Boys to name a few. But at the end of the day, they're mostly interchangeable, and I think the orcs forget there's a difference pretty often. When it comes to measuring their power, we have to get a little bit speculative. Warp entities like the gods get their power from collective belief and emotion. Take for example Slaanesh, they get their power from excess. So the more people pray to Slaanesh, and the more there's an abundance of hedonism and debauchery in the galaxy, the stronger they become. The orks have a presence in the warp just like every other living creature. And they are so unbelievably simple in nature that their gods don't have these grand mythologies with all this overlapping lore that tends to contradict itself. No, nothing like that. The orks think their gods are the best and thus they're the best. It's beautifully simple. So we have to then assume that this belief in their god's defining feature, being that they're bigger and tougher and stronger than every other god, would in fact begin to manifest. Consider how powerful the Eldar gods were when worshipped exclusively by the Eldari. The orks are the most numerous species in the entire Milky Way, outnumbering something like humanity 100 if not 1,000 to 1. It makes sense if you think about it, but as is orc tradition, it makes even more sense if you don't think too hard about it. And speaking of their mythology, we actually have a pretty good example of a legend about Gork and Mork that demonstrates they were at least strong enough to defeat one of the Chaos gods.
Right, so one day, Gork and Mork went looking for a gigantic squiggly beast, and they find it at the bottom of a huge cesspit. And also at the bottom of that cesspit was Nurgle, who had eaten all the snotlings. And Gork and Mork clobbered Nurgle so hard, he spewed up all the snotlings that were still alive. Nurgle shrank and became a squiggly beast. The snotlings then turned that squig into a feast for Gork and Mork.
This myth clearly represents the orcs' triumph over Nurgle. The orcs have no fear of the realms of Nurgle and thus happily thrive on squiggly beasts that breed in their cesspits. Despite this story, we don't see a lot of evidence of them fighting against the Chaos gods in the lore. Gork and Mork are not sending incursions of orc demons into real space, nor are their blessed followers turning into the equivalent of demon princes. But now that I think about it, that would actually be pretty awesome. However, from what I've read, all of this would certainly be possible. Gork and Mork really could be the strongest of the gods and can wipe the rest of them out. They are, however, too busy fighting themselves in the warp. That's all they've done since the dawn of the orcs, is just beat the crap out of each other. So if you want my personal, definitely unbiased opinion, Gork and Mork are definitely the strongest. But for the sake of trying to be as accurate as possible with my videos and not just throw out the dozens of hours of research I've put into each and every one of them, I have to rank them in the purely speculative realm. Also, some dude on Twitter theorized that Gork and Mork are just Khorne and Tzeentch, but they painted themselves green and whipped the orcs up into a frenzy. That's neither here nor there and is definitely not canon, but this is my video and it made me laugh, so I'm including it. Number 4. Tzeentch. Tzeentch, also known as the Changer of Ways or the Architect of Fate, is the chaos god of sorcery, knowledge, mutation, destiny, lies, and trickery. He is directly empowered by every mortal race through their desire to plot and deceive. All those who act deceptively or would pursue knowledge and understanding with a desire to ultimately manipulate the world around them inevitably draw the attention of Tzeentch. Every living creature exists in a state of mutability. We are all constantly changing in a million different ways, and not always readily apparent. From the grand and more obvious, like an advancement in rank within our society, down to the microscopic level of cellular division. As mortal beings, we are ultimately malleable, and that malleability has drawn the eyes of the Changer of Ways upon mankind. There are 1,001 ways in which an individual can come to worshiping Tzeentch, but in almost all of these cases, they involve a desire for change, whether that be through their own ambitions, a desire to escape their figurative or literal bonds that shackle them to a miserable existence, or in some instances, a desire for unbridled power. Because of this, Tzeentch often attracts would-be practitioners of the dark arts. His demons whisper forbidden secrets into the minds of mortals, telling them truths of the universe too impossible to be believed, yet ultimately impossible to ignore. The individual will then seek out answers to questions no mortal was ever meant to ask, and will ultimately find themselves as one of his faithful. The promise of power proving to be too intoxicating for mortals to resist. Across cultures, all of the gods have been depicted in a lot of different ways, but most often with several identifiable themes present in all of them. Tzeentch is the exception, and due to his nature as the incarnation of change without limits, this would make sense. He has been depicted as a twinkling constellation of blinking eyes, as a being of illuminating warp flame, an elaborate and intricate puppeteer that pulls on the infinite strands of fate, and most commonly in the 40K community, a giant blue squid monster. All magic, sorcery, and psychic abilities can trace their origin back to the Immaterium, and thus to Tzeentch, the master of magic in all its forms. He is able to perceive every event that has ever occurred across space and time, while also being able to see the strands of fate that lead to every potential future simultaneously. Trying to directly measure his intelligence with numbers is kinda meaningless, but to simplify it, this is an entity that would measure his IQ in the quintillions. He has plans within plans within plans, and the most mundane of events may set in motion a web of compounding instances that may not bear fruit for thousands of years, but will ultimately secure him victory. Yet this impossibly complex web of plans spreads so incomprehensibly wide over all of reality that it touches every living thing at one point or another, whether or not the individual realizes it or not. He perceives every event, intention, idea, thought, and whispered prayer of every mortal, and his impossibly complex mind is able to work out just how every single one of these will potentially impact the future. He watches over every sentient creature within the mortal universe with great enthusiasm, watching as each of his plots and schemes slowly begin to unfold into history. Tzeentch favors the cunning and intelligent over the physically strong, and thus rewards his followers with insight into the future and access to forbidden lore. He is ludicrously strong, but at one point was said to be even stronger. So strong, in fact, that the gods did the impossible. They set aside their differences to team up against him in order to bring him back down to their level. This was ultimately successful, but according to the Great Deceiver, was all part of his plan. Some believe that if Tzeentch truly willed it, he would end the Great Game and achieve dominance over the rest of the Pantheon. But due to his complicated and enthusiastic nature for the Great Game itself, he never would, and most likely is incapable of doing so. Based on Tzeentch's nature, I don't think he personally has the ability to win. The compulsion to keep the game going is just too ingrained in him, meaning doing anything that would end the game is actually an impossibility. Number 3. The Emperor of Mankind. The Emperor is without question the most powerful mortal to have ever lived, and by the time of the 42nd millennium, he has most likely become a god, although this is intentionally left purposely vague and cryptic within the lore. He was able to defeat and bind Dracnian, the demon created in the first murder. He is said to be more physically powerful than any of the Primarchs, which is incredibly impressive considering that we've watched Angron bench press a Warhound Titan, and Sanguinius take down 2 of them as well as a Warlord Titan in melee combat. He is known to project an aura that causes demons to flee in terror or burst into flames. He defeated an ascended Horus, his Primarch son that at the time of their battle had received an enormous power boost from all 4 Chaos Gods. As a child, he managed to kill his uncle by stopping his heart with a single thought. We've seen him use his incredible psychic might to force the entire Wordbearers Legion to kneel with a single psychic command. We also know that he is a perpetual and cannot truly die, and that he has mastered every form of academic study. So with that impressive list of feats that were accomplished when he was just a mortal, I'm guessing you're wondering why he's not ranked number 1 on this list, and we're gonna get into that. The Emperor of Mankind is not just a character, he is a plot device, a MacGuffin, a living deus ex machina, and every other literary trope you can think of, all wrapped up into a single entity. He is exactly as powerful as any individual story needs him to be. He is completely unknowable. He has plans within plans within plans. He has mastery over the ability to foresee into the future and can take a single action that will, over the course of thousands of years, come to create an entirely new societies. Much like what happened when he defeated the Void Dragon, imprisoned it upon Mars, and then subsequently the dreams of machines the Catan would generate in the inhabitants of the Red Planet would eventually give rise to the Mechanicum, a faction that would supply his armies with fantastical new war machines. He is a psychic phenomena, a hurricane of arcane potential. Yet, despite this, due to many contrasting depictions of him by different authors, we aren't able to get a real feel for the full scope of his abilities without filling in the blanks with our own interpretations of the text. On one hand, he is said to be powerful enough to challenge the ruinous powers, yet in a fight against a 30-foot-tall orc, he had to be saved by his son Horus. But did he throw the fight intentionally because his foresight told him that the resulting saving by his son would boost his confidence and thus play into future events? Who knows, maybe. There's nothing in that story to suggest that. No winking at the audience, no foreshadowing of future events, or some cryptic line at the end of the book. Yet, this is the narrative that many of us have adopted. As the godlike being who can go toe-to-toe with the Chaos Gods, losing to an admittedly enormous orc just doesn't make sense. But I feel that's kind of the point. The mystery, the uncertainty. No matter how much somebody learns about the Emperor, they are constantly left with even more questions by the end of each and every story. They are left in a constant state of doubt over what they think they know. And to me, That's the entire point of a character like the Emperor. Is he a giant, shimmering, godlike being that will lead humanity into the future? Or is he a shriveled up old perpetual that just projects an illusion of grandeur to manipulate those around him? Did all of these events actually happen? Or are they simply the result of thousands of years of propaganda and selective record purging? This is what makes the Emperor so fascinating, and above all else, in my personal opinion, a literary triumph. The idea that you can have this character be written about and expanded upon by dozens of different authors over multiple decades, each contributing a new element to the multifaceted enigma that is the Emperor. And yet, he never gets boring. He never falls into the Superman trope, wherein a character has demonstrated so many ludicrous feats over the years, it's impossible to take any threat he comes into contact with seriously. Because at the heart of it all, the reader is still left doubting what they think they know about him. I'll fully admit that the Emperor is one of my favorite characters. Not only is he deeply fascinating, but he's inspired more debates and late-night deep dives of obscure lore than any other character I can think of. Yet, because of his unknowable nature, assessing his true power level after his ascendancy to the realm of the spiritual is an impossible task. Every single failure of his can be written off as him either only using 1/100th of his power, or that failure was a secret victory, as the unraveling of one of his plans would put him closer to his ultimate goals. There is equal evidence to support such notions as true and false. Did he plan the Horus Heresy from the start in order to eliminate problematic legions much like he did with the Thunder Warriors? Did he know Magnus was going to sabotage his Webway Gate and thus made a problematic judgment call at Nicaea to ensure that it would happen? Was it his plan all along to end up on the Golden Throne so he could ascend to godhood? Did he seemingly crusade against religion in order to eliminate competition so once he was entombed there, he would be the only god left for humanity to turn to? Was he lying to Ra Endymion when he described his foresight as fallible? When it comes to the Emperor, the questions and mysteries are more captivating than any answer could ever possibly be. And if the writers are smart, they'll keep most of those mysteries unanswered. Aside from the examples of physical strength that I mentioned at the beginning of this, we also know that in Warhammer, beliefs have power. The more people believe in something, the more it begins to manifest in the warp. The Emperor has been worshipped as the one true god of humanity by quintillions of people across the galaxy for over 10,000 years. Thus, we can assume that his spiritual form has swelled immensely in power, many believing that he has truly become a god. If this is true, and he really is on the level of the Chaos Gods, then he would be able to display similar powers to them, and namely, the ability to create demons. Each demon is a splinter of their patron deity, having a portion of their personality and in many cases, supposedly looking like them. It is believed by some that the entities such as the Living Saints are the Emperor's equivalent to demon princes, and the Legion of the Damned is his equivalent of demons. Which would make sense. If the Emperor had the ability to create demons, they would certainly resemble Astartes. Now there is evidence to support both of those claims, but as of today, it is something that is still intentionally left vague and mysterious. The best tool we have for measuring his current power level is the accepted truth that the Emperor is in the warp, battling against the 4 Chaos Gods, and managing to keep them at bay. He's not strong enough to outright destroy them, but he can keep them from destroying the physical universe. His power is not absolute, because if it was, then we wouldn't be seeing demons manifest in our universe in the first place. If he was more powerful than the other gods, they would have all had to turn their attention solely on him. And herein lies the problem with the Emperor versus the Chaos Gods. We know that it's not just him fighting all of them at once, it's a 5-way battle, where everyone is fighting everyone. While the Emperor is fighting off all 4 of them at the same time. Nurgle, for example, is fighting Khorne, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, and the Emperor, also at the same time. It's exactly the same for each of the combatants. That means in this hypothetical scenario of a 4 against 1 in any direction, any of these figures could be eliminated. If the gods set aside their differences and gave the Emperor their full attention, it would be no contest. He would fail. We also know that if one of the gods manages to become too powerful, the others will unite to knock them back down to the same level as the rest of them. This happened famously with Tzeentch at one point, and the resulting battle between him and his siblings saw his crystal staff, said to be the most powerful weapon in all of existence, shattered into thousands of pieces, which then rained down upon the physical universe, each one representing a different spell, thus introducing magic to our realm. Even though Khorne is said to be the most powerful of all of the ruinous powers in the current setting, the other gods have not deemed him a sufficient enough threat to form an alliance. We can assume with that it is the same for the Emperor. He's powerful enough to be a problem, but not powerful enough for them to unite against. It is said that from our perspective, the Emperor is growing in power every single day as more and more of the beliefs, hopes, and love of humanity funnels into him. He swells in might and will one day overpower the Chaos Gods. It's similar to how the decadence and extremes of the Eldar swelled over time and eventually gave birth to Slaanesh. They started off as non-existent and grew more powerful over time until a breaking point was finally reached, and they ripped their way into our reality. However, it's important to remember that in Warhammer, when we speak of the Immaterium, time is meaningless. The Chaos Gods refer to Slaanesh as having always existed, even though we in the physical universe have an exact date when they were born. The gods are simultaneously at their weakest and strongest points. They have always and never existed at the same time. To me, this means that we will see the Emperor become more active over time, and it will appear as if he is getting stronger. But his battle in the warp against them is like trying to measure the immeasurable. The escalation is as ultimately irrelevant as it is impossible to quantify. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps he will never be strong enough to kill the other gods. Maybe introducing a god of order to the Pantheon will bring balance to the Immaterium. And maybe that's the best we can hope for. Number 2. Khorne. Khorne, also known as the Blood God or the Lord of Skulls, is the chaos god of war, violence, and bloodshed. He is the manifestation of anger, hatred, rage, and murder. Considering that Khorne derives his power from the desire to spill blood, it comes as little surprise that in the grim darkness of the 42nd millennia, where there is only war, Khorne is currently experiencing a resurgence and is considered to be the most powerful of the ruinous powers. The urge to commit violence in one form or another is one of the most basic drivers amongst any mortal species. It doesn't matter how advanced a society claims to be or how enlightened they've seemingly become. Violence is a primordial force that will never fully lessen its grip on mortals. Whether it be a warrior defending his home, a sadistic act of murder for murder's sake, or every drunken barroom brawl that has ever occurred, every violent act or expression of rage flows into the Immaterium and directly empowers the Blood God. Although he has been worshipped by countless civilizations across space and time, there are a lot of similarities to how he is depicted. He's often shown as being a towering giant with a canine head, armored in brass and seated upon a mountain of skulls, on top of which he lets loose bellowing war cries that echo through reality, a sanguine call to spill blood and take skulls. He is the physical and immaterial, figurative and literal incarnation of rage, and is often depicted wielding a mighty and terrible axe or sword known as Warbringer. A sword so powerful that it sunders reality when swung, cleaving through dimensions to eviscerate whatever has drawn the Blood God's ire. Despite being the most powerful, Khorne is also the most straightforward of the gods. He has an absolute disdain for tricksters and any who would lie or cheat their way to victory. Naturally, he and his followers hate sorcery in all its forms, and vastly prefer to fight with melee weapons, viewing those who use long-range firearms to wage war as cowards. The earliest lore on Khorne depicted him as a multifaceted god, of not just rage and blood, but also one of honor. Although the further along we move in the timeline and the more 40K lore gets updated, Khorne's honorable side has mostly taken a back seat. Although him and his followers still maintain certain convictions about how war should be fought, at the end of the day, Khorne cares not from whence the blood flows, only that it flows. When it comes to his mythology as a literal figure, we do have a pretty good example of his raw physical strength, wherein one of his most esteemed bloodthirsters, Skarbrand, sought to overthrow the Blood God after having been manipulated by Tzeentch into thinking he actually stood a chance against him. When Khorne's back was turned, Skarbrand threw everything he had into a single blow with his axe, a blow that was said to be so powerful it could have split entire worlds. This didn't even dent Khorne's armor. Enraged by the cowardice of the attack, Khorne grabbed Skarbrand by the neck and shook him so hard that all he had ever been, all of his personality, his cunning, his ambition, all of it was shaken out of him. He then threw the greater demon so hard he flew across space and time for 8 days straight, leaving an inconceivable burning trail of destruction in his wake. Remarkably, Skarbrand survived, and where once there was a proud warlord whose hubris caused him to fly too close to the proverbial sun, now was nothing more than a blood-crazed monster. Number 1. The Hive Mind. The hive mind of the Tyranids is without a doubt the most intelligent and dangerous thing that exists in our universe. It is able to simultaneously control seemingly infinite Tyranid organisms across infinite battlefields at the same time, orchestrating impossibly complex battle strategies and engineering new forms of evolution in order to overcome just about anything its enemies can throw at it. It is, for all intents and purposes, an organic quantum computer on a level that is completely incomprehensible. And it's not only controlling all of the Tyranids within our galaxy, a species that reproduces so quickly that it has effectively become the Milky Way's dominant life form, outnumbering every other species thousands of times over with the exception of potentially the orks. But the Tyranids come from outside of our galaxy, and some believe they have already consumed every other galaxy. Some say the fleets we have seen thus far are only a small portion of their entirety. The Tyranids are not only the most powerful faction within Warhammer, they are the most powerful character, as every single one of them is part of the same organism. The Tyranids are not a race or a species, it is a single creature. Despite their appearance as an alien dinosaur bug monster, it's more accurate to think of them as something like an aspen forest, wherein each individual that we see is part of the same single creature. But whereas the aspen forest can stretch out over multiple kilometers, the Tyranids have spread in a similar manner across multiple galaxies. It may even be more apt to think of them in a way that compares them to a human body. We are a single individual, but we are made up of dozens of trillions of cells. So too is each individual Tyranid a cell of the larger body that is the hive mind. The name, the hive mind, is not a title of a leader organism that controls the Tyranids. It is quite literal in that the entity is the combined consciousness of all Tyranids. Every single one, from the lowly Ripper all the way up to the massive ship-sized entities that ferry their troops across the stars, are simply smaller parts of the same body. When we think of the hive mind, we often tend to imagine some giant alien brain that exists out in the dark places between galaxies that controls all of the Tyranids. And there very well might be an organism like that, but even if there was, it would still just be another organ within the Tyranid body. The Eldar have come to believe that the hive mind is more powerful than Slaanesh and represents the greatest threat to the physical universe. This is a passage from Wraithflight, where one of the Eldari is able to, for a moment, tap into the hive mind's consciousness. Beyond the shield, she saw the great dragon's true form, not the hideous intrusions into the mortal realm that swam the Black Star Sea, nor as a Farseer might see it, as a great and braided cable of malicious fate dominating all the skein. The first was merely part of the whole, the second, psychic abstraction. What Lyanna instead saw was the reality of its soul. It was a great shadow when seen from afar, a wave of dread and psychic blindness that preceded the Hive Fleet's arrival. But the greatest shadows are cast by the brightest lights, and seen closely, the soul of the hive mind shone brighter than any sun. She was so close now that she perceived the rigid topography of its mind, larger than star systems, an entity bigger than a god. It contemplated thoughts as large as continents and spun plans more complex than worlds. It dreamed dreams that could not be fathomed. She felt small and afraid before it, but she did not let her fear cow her defiance. Against this vista flickered the souls of the Eldar, their jewel brightness dimmed by the incomparable glare of the great dragon. And this was but a tendril of the creature. The bulk of it stretched away, coils wrapped tight around higher dimensions, joining in the distance to others and then others again, until at a great confluence of the parts sat the terrible truth of the whole. She stared at its brilliance. Unlike her passionless dead warriors, who felt naught but the echoes of wrath at the sight, she was fascinated by the beauty on display. She thought, if only such a thing could be tamed, it would drive out she who thirsts forever. If only its hunger was for things other than the meat and blood of our worlds. Perhaps most telling, though, is the hive mind's presence within the warp, and for that, we can look no further than the anti-psychic phenomena the Tyranids generate, known as the shadow in the warp. It's basically a massive null field around the Tyranids that blocks all connection to the immaterium. If you are familiar with the Sisters of Silence in 40K, or blanks in general, you know they are an individual person that produces a similar field. Being in the presence of such a creature is physically painful for psychers, and elongated exposure can cause, in some cases, severe physical and psychological damage for them, let alone the fact that in the presence of a blank, they cannot utilize their powers. The size of this null sphere is different from blank to blank depending on their ability, but when you take the Tyranids as a singular organism, their null field is just on a completely incomprehensible scale that literally blocks out sections of the warp. There was an interesting passage in the novel Darkness in the Blood, wherein a ship traveling through the warp became besieged by demons. The situation is pretty bleak until a vast darkness falls over the ship and utterly snuffs out the invaders. And then a sea change. The warp altered, though subtly at first. Rosalys had little experience as a navigator of ships. Had he been born to the role, he might have noticed it sooner. Like ancient mariners, tasted the shift from salt to sweet in the waters of Terra's lost oceans. But soon it became apparent to him that the tempest was calming. The shrieking idioforms and psychopomps struggled to take shape. Those that manifested were sucked back to nothingness amongst the energies that birthed them. Colors bled away, currents stilled. A black wall was growing ahead, as impenetrable as the densest fog bank and infinitely more forbidding. The task force sped towards it. The armored angel glinted in front of the darkness and vanished within completely. Against all the laws that governed it, the Empyrean lost its mutability. Blackness seeped from the roiling wall of shadow. The visions and images weakened and then stopped altogether. There was a brief passage through warp space of a primordial calmness, smooth and bright as a moonlit pond, and then the flotilla plunged into darkness. A new terror assailed Raculus. A vast, godlike mind turned its attention upon the ships. So puissant it quelled the fury of the warp. The hive mind was the truth of the Tyranids. The Blood Angels believed the war beasts that plagued the universe were merely the material extrusion of something far greater, and that thing dwelt in the warp. The pressure of the hive mind's regard was immense, crushing Raculus's soul until it felt infinitely small. At great remove, he felt blood trickle from the corners of his mortal eyes. The idea that the hive mind is a larger threat than the Chaos Gods is also backed up by an Eldar Farseer in the novel Godblight, wherein he states that comparing it to the Catan and the Chaos Gods, the Great Devourer is perhaps a greater threat than all of them. The Necrons seem to think so as well, as the Tyranids' arrival was what propelled the Silent King out of exile in the first place. The fact that these immortal beings that enslaved and shattered their own gods were afraid of the hive mind is a statement in and of itself. And I just kind of want to put it into perspective. All of the major threats that exist in 40K that could theoretically wipe out humanity have all been around for an enormously long time. The Necrons, the Orks, and the Eldari have existed for over 60 million years. The Chaos Gods, at least in the realm of the Warp, have always existed. Even the Tau, the youngest of all of the factions in 40K, have been around for a few thousand years. The first recorded contact with the Tyranids was in 745 M41, the 745th year of the 41st millennium. The furthest point in the timeline that we've seen so far is 15 years past the start of the 42nd millennium, which means that they've only been observed in our galaxy for 270 years. In the grand timeline of the universe, that's less time than it takes to blink. And yet already, they are being spoken about as if they are the end to all things. In other videos, I've ruminated on just how powerful the Tau, for example, will be if they were given another 1,000 years to continue developing. Where will the Tyranids be 100 years from now? 200 years? 300? As more Tyranids continue to flood into our galaxy, and the ones that are already here continue to repopulate out of control. The singular organism that is the hive mind represents the largest threat to every living creature in the galaxy. They are the end times. And due to the twofold factor of first, their primary driving force being the consumption of all organic life, and second, that consumption resulting in the destruction of all those who empower the gods, while simultaneously growing the shadow in the warp that sunders the connection between the physical and the immaterial, blotting out sections of the warp and further reducing the gods' effectiveness. The Pantheon has no ability to influence the hive or any members of its infinite brood. Thus, the stronger and larger it gets, the weaker they in turn become. The hive mind is a larger threat to the galaxy than all of the gods combined, and is more threatening to each god on an individual level than any of their other siblings or the Emperor. It is for those reasons that I award the #1 spot to the hive mind as the most powerful entity in all of Warhammer 40K. But what do you guys think? Do you agree with my list, or would you change the order around? Is there somebody that definitely deserved to be on this list that I forgot to include? Who do you think is the most powerful character in 40K, and who do you think is the weakest? What's a character that you think is currently not super powerful, but in the future may come to be one of the strongest figures in the entire galaxy? I'm super curious to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. And make sure to download War Thunder by using my link in the description of this video to get an amazing welcome pack, which includes multiple premium vehicles, account boosters, and a whole lot more. It's free to play and has some of the most amazing and historically accurate PvP battles ever created. Big thanks for watching my video all the way through. The watch time seriously helps out my channel a lot. And let me know down in the comments what other topics you'd like me to cover from Warhammer 40K. Also, what's your favorite type of videos that I post? Do you like when I do the Grimdark Story Hour, or are you more of a deep dive person? Anyways, with all that out of the way, I'll catch y'all in the next one.